Hey there, Jin here. If you like fire, and balls of fire, and fireballs, then this is the place for you, because today I'll be sharing a fireball build. It handles bosses, nightmare dungeons, vaults, and the overworld alike. If you like content like this, please consider liking and subscribing as it helps out the channel a lot. So without further ado, let's get to the build. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to take 2 into Firebolt. Then we're going to come down here and take 5 into Fireball. And we're going for Destructive Fireball. Then we're going to take 1 point into Devastation. And 3 into Elemental Dominance. Then we come down here to our defensive skills. We're going to take 1 into Flame Shield. And 1 into Enhanced Flame Shield. Then we're going to take 5 into Teleport, and go for Shimmering Teleport. We'll also take 3 in Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, and 1 into Ice Armor, to go to Mystical Ice Armor. So next up in our Conjuration skills, we're going to go for Ice Blades, and then Summoned Ice Blades. We're also going to take 3 into Precision Magic, 1 into Align the Elements to get the 3 in Protection, and the 3 into Mana Shield. Next up, in the Mastery skills, we're going to take 3 into Inner Flames, and then we're also going to take 3 into Devouring Blaze. Then for our ultimate skills, we're going to take the Inferno, and we're going to take all the nodes there. And then we're going to take Fiery Surge, 3 points into that. And we're going to take Soulfire, 3 points into that. And lastly, for our key passive, we're going to be taking Esu's Ferocity. So pretty straightforward here. And next up we have the Paragon Board. So for the Paragon boards, in the starting board I'm putting in Elementalist. So Paragon nodes within range gain 75% bonus to their non-physical damage and damage reduction modifiers. And that's going to give us dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. So it is a 15% damage boost there. For our second board, we're going for the Enchantment Master board. And we're going to be putting in Reinforced here. And that's going to give us 125% bonus to all rare nodes within range. And in this case that will be extra non-physical damage, and extra resistance to all elements. We also gain 15% damage reduction while we have an active barrier. For our third board, it's going to be the Searing Heat board. And we're going to make sure we pick up the legendary node here. So Pyromancy skills have 12% increased critical strike chance, and deal direct damage equal to 10% of our damage with fire bonus, and which we have 30%. For the glyph we're going to put in Pyromaniac. That's going to give us extra fire damage thanks to Flame Touched. And every Pyromancy skill we cast, or every second we channel Incinerate, increases our fire damage by 2% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 10%. For our fourth board, we're going to be going for the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to be putting in the Destruction glyph for the extra critical strike damage, and critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. Pretty straightforward for that one. And for our fifth board, we're going to be going for the Elemental Summoner board, and we're going to be putting in the Territorial glyph for the extra damage to close enemies, and we also gain 15% damage reduction against close enemies. For the sixth and final board, it's going to be the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to put in the Flame Feeder glyph here for the damage to burning enemies, as well as getting the 10% multiplicative increased direct damage to burning enemies. So really straightforward Paragon board here, and if I went too fast for you, don't worry, all of this is going to be in the build planner in the description below, so make sure you check that out if you want to go at your own pace. Next up we have the Enchantments. we're going to be using the Fireball enchantment. So when we kill an enemy, they explode in a fireball for 50% of its damage. It's just more damage overall. And for our second enchantment, we're using the Firebolt enchantment. So all of our direct damage will apply burning damage for 8 seconds. And that enables our Flame Feeder glyph. If you're versing Lilith, you could replace Fireball with Teleport. Next, for the Seneschal construct, we're going to be using the Tempest Governing Stone. And for the Tuning Stones, we'll be using Breaking Support, Efficiency Support, and Arcing Support. If you have mana issues, you would replace Efficiency Support with Resource Support. For our other Governing Stone, we'll be using Flash of Adrenaline, and we're using that with Tactical Support, Duration Support, and Initiative Support. And if you happen to have Evernight, you would replace Arcing Support with Evernight. And if you happen to have Genesis, you would replace Initiative Support with Genesis. Next up we have the gear. So for the gear on the left side of the screen, I will put the affixes you would look for from best to worst. Starting with the Helm, we're going to be wanting a Godslayer crown here for the insane damage we get, as well as this unique passive. When we stun, freeze or immobilize an enemy elite or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies and we deal 30 to 60% multiplicative increased damage to them for 3 seconds, occurring once every 12 seconds. If you can't get a Godslayer crown, then you would want to be looking for something with total armor percent, cooldown reduction, max life, and intelligence. If you can't get those, then go for maximum mana or all stats. And for the aspect, you would want to use Everliving for 20 to 25% damage reduction from vulnerable or crowd controlled enemies. And of course, if you have a Shaco, you would use that here instead. Next up, for the chest piece, we're going to be looking for something with total armor percent, damage reduction against burning, and something like fire damage or pyromancy skill damage. If you can't get those, then look for damage reduction against distant, or damage reduction from close enemies. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of Disobedience, so we gain 1.1%, in my case increased armor for 4 seconds when we deal any form of damage, stacking up to 66%. This is basically a must-have, giving you a huge armor boost. So for the gloves, we'll be using Gloves of the Illuminator for the Fireball attack speed, crit chance, lucky hit, chance to restore primary resource, and ranks into Fireball. But also, the unique aspect is a must-have for this build. Fireball will now bounce as it travels, exploding each time it hits the ground, but its explosion will deal 35 to 25% less damage. Definitely want this for the build as it allows you to clear out whole screens of enemies super fast. If you can't get these, you would look for gloves with crit chance, ranks into Fireball, attack speed, and lucky hit percent. If you can't get those, look for intelligence and crit chance when injured. As for the aspect, you would want to use something like the aspect of control to deal bonus damage to immobilized, stunned or frozen enemies, or something like Edgemasters, so your skills will deal 10 to 20% increased damage based on primary resource when cast. Next up we have the pants. We're going to go for 2 ults will here, and that's going to give us a lot of extra damage, as well as some damage reduction from close enemies, but importantly, we'll deal 20 to 40% increased damage while unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, and when we become unstoppable, we gain 50 of our primary resource. So that is a good amount of mana back there when we need it. Now if you can't get Tybalt's Will, you would use some defensive pants with total armor percent, damage reduction against distant, damage reduction against burning, flat damage reduction against close, and damage reduction against injured if you can't get the others. So pretty straightforward there. For the aspect, you would use something defensive. If you have a Godslayer crown on already, you would use Everliving here. If not, then you would use something like the Protector, so when you damage an elite, you get a barrier for 10 seconds, or something like Crowded Sage. So pretty straightforward there. Next up we have the boots. We're going for Essu's Heirloom here, so that's going to give us a lot of movement speed, a lot of critical strike damage, and some mana cost reduction too, which is really handy. Also, our critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 30% of our movement speed bonus, which is really good. Alternatively, you can use a flicker step, and that's going to allow you to play a little bit differently, as you'll be using your evade to dash through enemies after you use your Inferno skill. It's just a little bit of a different playstyle. Both work really well, so just pick accordingly. And if you don't have either of those, you would want to look for boots with movement speed percent, ranks into teleport, mana cost reduction, and intelligence. If you can't get those, then look for all stats and damage reduction when injured. As for the aspect, you would use something like Ghostwalkers, so whilst unstoppable, and for 4 seconds after, you'll gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed, and can move freely through enemies. Next up we have the main weapon. We're going to be looking for a Staff of Endless Rage here. It's going to give us a lot of fire damage, core skill damage, damage to close, and some ranks into Inner Flames. And also, every third cast of Fireball launches 2 additional projectiles and deals 20 to 40% increased damage. So this is also pretty key to the build, so definitely want to look for one of these, and make sure you get the highest item power possible. Now if you don't have access to this, then you would use a one-handed weapon, a wand or a dagger, and you would look for intelligence, all stats, crit damage, and damage to close enemies. If you can't get those, then look for damage to vulnerable enemies. As for the aspect, you would want to use something like Storm Swell here, so you deal 21 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies whilst having a barrier active. And for the offhand, you're going to be looking for something with crit chance percent, mana cost reduction, cooldown reduction, and resource generation. If not those, then damage reduction against burning, intelligence, and all stats. And for the aspect, you would want to be using Conceited, so you deal 15 to 25% increased damage when you have a barrier active. If you do happen to have the weapon already, the Staff of Endless Rage, then you could use Conceited on the gloves instead of using Control or Edgemasters. Next up we have the Amulet. So we're going to be looking for something with total armor percent, devouring blaze, movement speed, and mana cost reduction. If you can't get those, then look for cooldown reduction, and the other damage reduction types like damage reduction from close or distant, or normal damage reduction. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the 3 curses aspect here, so that will increase our critical strike damage of Fireball by 30 to 60%, and double this damage against healthy targets. And that's why we put it on the Amulet for the 1.5 times bonus. Next up we have the rings. We're going to be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That gives us a bunch of non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource generation and cooldown reduction. But also for each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. So that is a huge chunk of damage there. That's like an extra 36% damage in my case. For the other ring, we're going to be using the Ring of Starless Skies, and that gives us a good amount of critical strike chance, critical strike damage, core skill damage, and lucky hit chance. But also, spending our primary resource reduces the resource cost of our skills, and increases our damage by 10% for 3 seconds, and that will stack up to 40%. So 4 times it stacks. If you don't have access to either of these rings, you would be looking for rings with crit chance, resource generation, crit damage, and fire damage. If you can't get those, then damage to vulnerable or damage to close enemies. And as for the aspects, you would be using something like Elementalist on one of them, so core and mastery skills cast at or above 100 mana, gain 20 to 40% increased crit strike chance, which is really solid. Or something like Prodigies if you're having mana issues, so your cooldowns will restore 15 to 25 mana. Or you could use one of the previously mentioned damage aspects, such as Control, Edgemasters, or Conceited. That wraps it up for the items. So for the gems, we'll be using the skulls in the jewellery, red gems, the rubies in the armour, and the green gems in the weapons, which I completely forgot to put in, so I've basically just been using this build without the green gems in the weapons, but obviously still works, and I will go and do that right now. So that pretty much wraps up the video, guys. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, and hit the notification bell as it helps out the channel a lot, and it would be much appreciated. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I will leave you with some fireball destroying demon footage. Have a good day. Bye.